There's a point in a relationship where things stop feeling confusing in a normal way and start feeling confusing in a way that makes you question your own mind. You replay conversations, trying to find what you missed. You adjust your tone, your timing, even your words, just to avoid that sudden shift in her mood. One moment she feels close, warm, engaged, and then something changes without explanation. She becomes distant, colder, or simply unavailable, in a way that feels intentional but is never acknowledged. And the hardest part is not the distance itself, it's the silence around it. No clear explanation, no direct communication. Just a shift that you're expected to adapt to without question. Over time, you start walking on emotional eggshells, trying to keep things stable, trying to bring back the version of her that made you feel secure. If you've been in this kind of dynamic, there's something important you need to hear clearly. The confusion you felt was not random. The emotional instability you experienced was not because you were too sensitive, too attached, or too demanding. It was the result of a pattern that creates emotional imbalance while keeping the other person trying harder to fix it. And when you're inside that kind of dynamic, you don't notice how much of yourself you're giving away just to keep things calm. What you experienced often comes from a relational pattern where emotional control, validation, and distance are used in subtle ways. Not always consciously and not always with obvious intent, but consistently enough that the relationship stops feeling equal. One person becomes the emotional center, deciding the tone, the closeness, and the distance. The other becomes the adapter, constantly adjusting, interpreting, and trying to stabilize things. This is where the psychological pattern begins to take shape. It's not about a single behavior, it's about consistency. When affection is unpredictable, when accountability is avoided, when emotional closeness feels conditional, your mind starts working overtime to restore balance. You start focusing more on managing the relationship than experiencing it. One of the earliest signs is emotional inconsistency. She may be warm and attentive at times, making you feel deeply seen and valued.
Then, without a clear reason, she becomes distant or disengaged. When you ask about it, the answer is often vague or deflective. Nothing is clearly addressed. This creates a loop where you begin to associate closeness with uncertainty. Psychologically, the brain starts chasing predictability, trying to regain the earlier sense of connection. Another pattern is selective communication. She responds when it suits her emotional state, not necessarily when communication is needed. Messages may be ignored for hours or days, and then suddenly answered with normality, as if nothing happened. Over time, this teaches you to suppress your own needs. You stop expressing concerns because you don't want to push her away. Instead, you wait, you adjust, and you internalize the discomfort. There is also the pattern of emotional reversal. When you bring up something that hurt you, the focus subtly shifts away from the original issue and toward your reaction. You find yourself explaining your feelings instead of receiving understanding for them. This creates confusion because the problem is no longer what happened, but how you responded to what happened. Gradually, you become more careful about expressing discomfort at all. Another sign is conditional closeness. Affection feels available but not stable. It appears after compliance, agreement, or emotional restraint on your part. When you express too much need or clarity, the distance increases. This teaches you to minimize yourself in order to maintain connection. You begin to believe that being fully honest might cost you emotional access. Over time, this creates a quiet form of self-silencing. You start editing your thoughts before speaking. You measure your words based on how she might react instead of whether they are true for you. And without realizing it, your emotional world begins to orbit around someone else's unpredictability. One of the deeper effects of this dynamic is emotional dependency mixed with self-doubt. You start questioning your own interpretation of events. You wonder if you are asking for too much, if you are misreading situations, or if your expectations are unreasonable. This is not because you lack clarity, but because the feedback you receive is inconsistent enough to make clarity feel unstable. Another important behavior pattern is lack of accountability during emotional rupture. When conflict happens, resolution often does not involve clear responsibility. Instead, the situation becomes blurred. Either the topic is avoided, minimized, or redirected. This leaves emotional tension unresolved, but the surface of the relationship appears intact. You learn to move on without closure, carrying unresolved feelings quietly. And perhaps one of the most confusing experiences is when affection returns after distance. After periods of emotional withdrawal, things may suddenly feel warm again. Connection returns, attention returns, and you feel relief. But this cycle creates emotional conditioning. The brain starts associating distance with eventual reward, which keeps you emotionally invested even when the pattern is unhealthy. This cycle is not about a single moment.
It's about repetition. Emotional distance, followed by reconnection, followed by confusion, followed by self-adjustment. Over time, this rhythm becomes familiar, even if it feels painful. Familiarity can quietly replace clarity. At some point, something begins to shift internally. You start noticing that you are doing more emotional labor than you used to. You are thinking more, analyzing more, trying harder, while the other person remains emotionally unchanged in their approach. This imbalance is often the first real moment of awareness. Awareness doesn't come as a dramatic realization. It comes as quiet exhaustion. A feeling that you are constantly trying to understand something that should not require this much effort. A sense that love, care, or connection should not feel like decoding a pattern. When you reach this stage, the most important shift is stepping back from interpretation. Instead of trying to figure out what she meant, you start observing what is consistently happening. Behavior becomes more important than explanation. Patterns become more important than moments. And in that space of clarity, something stabilizes inside you. You begin to see that you were not dealing with confusion caused by your sensitivity, but confusion created by inconsistency. You were responding normally to an abnormal emotional pattern. From here, boundaries become clearer. Not as punishment, not as reaction, but as structure for your own emotional stability. You stop over-explaining your feelings to someone who repeatedly does not hold them with care. You stop chasing clarity from someone who benefits from ambiguity. And you stop adjusting your emotional presence to maintain temporary peace. Detachment in this sense is not coldness. It is returning emotional energy back to yourself. It is no longer letting unpredictability dictate your internal state. You still care, but you stop abandoning yourself in the process of caring. Self-respect begins to rebuild quietly. You start noticing what feels balanced and what doesn't. You become less tolerant of emotional inconsistency, not out of anger, but out of understanding. You realize that stability is not something you negotiate for repeatedly. It is something that should already exist in how someone relates to you. And slowly, the emotional fog begins to clear. What once felt complicated starts to feel simple in hindsight. Not because it was ever simple, but because you are no longer inside the cycle trying to make sense of every shift in real time. What remains after this clarity is not bitterness. It is perspective. You understand that some dynamics are not meant to be solved through effort alone. They require distance to see clearly. And once you see them clearly, you stop romanticizing the confusion you once tried so hard to fix. Healing doesn't always feel like moving on quickly. Sometimes, it feels like no longer needing answers that used to consume you. It feels like your mind becoming quieter when you think about what happened. It feels like your emotional world returning to a place where peace is not dependent on someone else's unpredictability. And from that place, you don't just leave a pattern behind. You leave behind the version of yourself that was constantly trying to survive inside it. What replaces it is something steadier. A quieter sense of awareness, a clearer understanding of what connection should feel like when it is not built on confusion, and a growing ability to choose relationships where you do not have to lose yourself to maintain them. That is where real emotional independence begins, not in rejecting connection, but in no longer abandoning yourself inside it.